Right, if everyone's ready. Another half minute to find your seats. Hope all enjoyed the lunch, but fear not, the eating is not over, because we've got a feast with this next panel session. Very good. I should say, Marcus told me that we've got a good solid number of viewers from afar. So I think there's about as many viewing at a distance as there are in the room, which is positive. So this afternoon, we're just going to run on with the sequence of the day. The theme is changing trading relationships. So obviously front of center of that is the trading relationship with the EU and beyond. We have a changing situation with trade, and obviously Brexit's pretty much center with that, but the trading situation wider than Brexit is also changing. There are obviously trade discussions and trade conflicts that are having a ripple effect on seafood. So we can't ignore that. And so one of the challenges is we've got to understand that that situation, our trading situation. We've got to understand what we are trading as a seafood industry. What does that portfolio look like, in order that we can not only respond to those changes, but also that we can try and shape them. And that was a point that was perhaps more broadly made by the Cabinet Secretary, but also Mike Park, in the sense that it's not public servants that are going to be spotting the opportunities or saying we should go this way or that. It's going to be industry stakeholders. So it's incumbent on us all to support industry as best we can in that regard. There are different tools and initiatives at play that can help industry understand that trading situation. We've got some of the speakers this afternoon who give a bit of a flavor of that. We've got Arena talking about a trade tool which shows the data in relation to trade flows for seafood in and out of the UK. We've got Susanna talking about scenarios on trading situations and the implications of certain trading conditions. We've got market opportunities from Graham Young, and we've got obviously government policy from Colin Faulkner later on as well. But just to open this session, and we will have questions and answers at the end of this session. So as we hear the different speakers and what they have to say, please bear in mind some questions you might have, and we can collect them at the end. But just to open up the session, can I welcome Susanna Wormsley from ABP Mayor. And Susanna's going to talk a little bit about some scenario work she's been doing with Sussex University on EU exit and UK trade flows. Susanna.
Thank you very much, Angus. Right, yes. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you very much. It's a great forum to be presenting to. So I'm going to be telling you a bit about some of this work on trade modelling that we've carried out with the University of Sussex and Vivid Economics. It was originally done as a study for Marine Scotland, and then we subsequently modelled some different trading scenarios, which is what I'm going to be presenting here today. I think you're all pretty well versed in the context of fisheries, Brexit and trade. We've had a number of presentations over the last, over today and yesterday that have covered much of the background, so I'll be able to go through that fairly quickly. I'll describe the scenarios that we've looked at and how the modelling approach was developed, and then go through some of the results of the modelling. I mean, the spoiler is, tariffs bad, zonal attachment good. But there are a number of sort of nuances and interesting messages that come out through that. So, despite what we all think, overall to the UK economy, fishing is relatively small. It's less than 1% of UK GVA, and 35,000 people employed in the fishing and fish processing industries. And that's compared to sort of 180,000 in car manufacturing, or 1.3 million employed in financial services. So in terms of the overall UK economy, it's relatively small. And in terms of trade as well, fish and fish products are less than 1% of UK trade with the rest of the world and with the EU. But the sector is more important in Scotland, both in terms of employment and also in terms of trade. It's 3.5% of Scotland's trade with the EU. But despite that, we all know fishing and fisheries are really important. And the UK waters hold important fishing grounds. And that was described by Mike and by Alan, where EU vessels land an awful lot more fish from our waters than UK vessels do from the EU waters. And so the fishing industry and fisheries in general have the potential to contribute an awful lot more to the UK economy if we can capture more of that resource. Additionally, the fishing and fisheries is highly sensitive, not just in the UK, but also in the EU. And there are very strong lobby groups in the UK and also in EU and partner countries. And part of this is related also to the timing of when the UK joined the EU, and which happened at just the same time that countries were starting to establish their exclusive economic zones under UNCLOS. And it resulted in the UK never really being able to establish its rights over that resource when those opportunities were coming in. And the feeling that our fishing resources have been sold down the river and given away under the CFP principle of equal access. So when it comes to looking at fisheries production and trade flows and how these might be affected by different sort of parameters around Brexit, the key elements to look at are obviously tariffs, which are a tariff levied on the value or quantity of goods traded, but also these non-tariff measures that we've been hearing more about around the catch certificates, export health certificates, additional administration and bureaucracy and possible delays that might take place. And then also in terms of the fisheries management side, there's the quota allocation aspect, which controls or limits the amount of output that's possible from the sector. So currently we have the EU's relative stability key under the CFP, which are based on historical shares. And there may be a potential to move towards something that's more along the lines of zonal attachment, where the fish are caught or where they reside. So the scenarios that we looked at, we have a baseline scenario which all of the others are compared to, which really sort of represents the status quo. Then the first scenario is looking at something similar to the EEA or the sort of the EU-Norway agreement. So here we would have a free trade agreement with the EU under similar terms to the EEA. So there would be some tariffs on fish and fish products at a level that's similar to the tariffs that Norway currently pays, and a small increase in the level of non-tariff barriers. But in this scenario, we maintain the quota allocation the same as it is currently, so based on relative stability. We then look at a no-deal scenario. So what might happen if we crash out and we have most favored nation or WTO tariffs with the EU and with the rest of the world, and a higher level of non-tariff measures. The third scenario is no deal, but we managed to sign free trade agreements with all non-EU and non-EEA countries. And this is a scenario that has been pushed by a number of Brexiteers around the idea that, well, it doesn't matter, we don't need the EU market because we're going to open up this whole world of trading opportunities with other countries in the world, and we'll be able to sign all these free trade agreements. So that scenario unpicks that a little bit. In scenario 4, we look at a no-deal scenario with free trade agreements, but importantly here, a shift to what happens if we're able to move to something that resembles more like zonal attachment in terms of quota allocations. And we've looked at a shift to either to 50% or 100% of potential quotas for that. And then the final scenario, which is no deal and unilateral free trade, so where the UK liberalizes tariffs on imports to the UK. I must say, when I was invited to give this presentation, I was a little bit concerned that things might change and I might end up presenting on scenarios that were essentially redundant because we might know what was happening. Happily or unhappily, that's not the case, and all of these scenarios are still very much all to play for. And this fifth scenario, the unilateral free trade, really is quite a close representation of what the UK's no-deal tariff schedule is, which is potentially sort of liberalising trade into the UK. Apart from, there's a few sort of fish and fishery products that would maintain tariffs, but they're not ones that we've included in the modelling. So that scenario still pretty much represents the no-deal tariff schedule. So in terms of developing the trade model, it's a partial equilibrium trade model, which works with a sort of multi-market scenario. So we're not just looking at trade between the UK and the EU, but we're looking at trade with all of the other countries in the world, which is, so it allows imports and exports between countries to adjust simultaneously based on changes to tariffs and changes to production. Each species is modeled independently. So we have sort of cod and haddock, but they're done independently. So changes in production for cod doesn't affect demand for haddock, for example. So we selected 10 species to look at. This is a selection of shellfish, whitefish, and pelagic species, and also including salmon produced from aquaculture, given its importance to Scottish seafood sector and exports. The species that were selected represent 67% of UK landings by value and 94% of UK aquaculture. And they were selected according to their importance for landings, to trade, potential for increases in quota through zonal attachment, and also their importance to the Scottish fleet. The graphs on the right here show the percentage of UK exports of each of those species to the EU, and the percentage of imports from the EU. So for some species like hake, nephrops, saithe and scallop on the top graph, almost all of our exports go to the EU, so we're currently very dependent on the EU market. And some of those issues come through in the trade results. This shows the importance of those species in terms of value to each of the UK home nations. Nephrops and mackerel are the two most important species by value, and the majority of landings of those species are from Scottish vessels. But all of the species selected are of importance to the Scottish fleet. So when it comes to putting together the trade model, there's a number of different types of data from different sources that need to be brought together. So we've looked at fisheries production, fisheries trade, tariffs information, and estimates of non-tariff measures and their sort of magnitude for fish and fishery products. In terms of tariffs, this shows the EU sort of WTO tariffs for each of the species that we've modeled. Different forms of each species have different tariff rates. So usually less processed forms have a lower tariff rate than higher processed forms. And that's to protect the processing sector within the EU so that they can import unprocessed fish cheaply and process it and gain the value added from processing. So for each of the species, we calculated an average value across the trade codes that we were looking at. So you notice here that salmon is relatively low at 4.9% because the unprocessed and minimally processed forms attract only a 2% tariff, which is to provide raw material for the EU processing industry. But tariffs for some shellfish, such as nephrops and scallops, can be much higher, sort of around 8 to 20%, depending on the form. What about quota changes then and zonal attachment? Mike introduced the study by Scottish Fishermen's Federation and the University of Aberdeen, which looked at zonal attachment percentages in the North Sea and west of Scotland. And that's the study that we used to look at what the percentage increase in quota for the UK might be. Where we assumed that the UK would gain extra quota from a shift to zonal attachment, we assumed a similar reduction to the EU's quota. So where the UK gains, the EU would lose out. So in terms of the results, the potential impact of these scenarios on UK output, and this is the aggregate results across the 10 species that we looked at. So the important things to notice here that any introduction of tariffs and increase in non-tariff measures has a negative impact on UK output due to the higher cost of trade. So that's particularly, you can see on the three scenarios on the left, the EEA level tariffs, no deal, and no deal with free trade agreements. The free trade agreement scenario shows that FTAs with the rest of the world cannot replace the loss of the UK market. There's still a reduction in UK output, even if we manage to sign free trade agreements with every other country in the world. And importantly, I think this question was raised yesterday when we were looking at the tariff schedules and the no-deal tariffs. When you look at the unilateral free trade scenario on the right-hand side, that also shows a reduction in UK output because we're potentially able to import a lot more fish at zero tariff rates, so we can import more fish more cheaply, and that has a knock-on impact on the potential demand from the UK catching sector. The two sort of more positive-looking scenarios in the middle are where we have a shift to zonal attachment by the 50 or 100%. And there we see a really quite significant boost to UK output of between 5 and 10%, and a corresponding decrease in EU output, which is the blue lines underneath. So even with paying MFN WTO tariffs to the EU market, that potential increase in quota that we would be able to obtain sort of more than compensates for that overall. In terms of the impact on trade, those changes in output are similar, reflected in the impact on trade. We've got exports at the top and imports on the bottom. Again, the UK is shown in red and the EU in blue. So under the scenarios with increasing tariffs, we have lower levels of exports and lower imports to the UK. Where we have a zonal attachment, there's a huge increase in UK exports as a result, and a reduction in imports. Under the unilateral free trade agreement, there's an increase in imports to the UK, the bottom right, because it affects the UK output. But those are the results sort of in aggregate across all 10 of the species that we looked at, and there are obviously differences when you look at individual species. These are the results on price, output, exports and inputs for the no deal scenario. I won't go through the details, but you can see that there's the reduction in UK output is greater for species that are more reliant on the EU market, such as hake, scallop and cod. There's also a relatively low impact on salmon because of the relatively low tariffs to the EU, and a lot more of the output is exported to the US. So when we look at that here, the turquoise bars here are the no deal scenario, and the blue bars are the no deal with 50% zonal attachment. So the impact for no deal is mostly negative for the UK, but there's potential for significant gains when we look at moving to zonal attachment. And the most significant increases are for the species that have the greatest potential for us to increase our quota through zonal attachment, such as herring, hake, mackerel and saithe. But the species that are not managed through tax don't have that potential boost to output from zonal attachment. So things like the shellfish, crab and scallop, and also salmon, which is produced by aquaculture, they suffer the negative impacts of an increase in tariffs without the positive effect of potential increase in quota. In the original study that we did for Marine Scotland, we also looked at the wider economic impacts on the Scottish economy of these scenarios. And the no deal scenario was common across both studies. So I'm going to focus on that here. So we looked at the changes at UK level and apportioned those between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and between the fishing, processing and aquaculture sectors. And these showed that the no deal scenario would result in a decline of around 85 million to output in the Scottish sector, or £17 million decline in GVA, mostly attributable to the processing sector, but also significantly to the fishing sector. And there are obviously knock-on impacts throughout the economy as well because of the linkages with other sectors. And some of the other sectors most affected are those related to sort of processing, packaging, transport and fuel. So in summary, policy around fishing and fish processing and trade is complex and politically sensitive. All of the scenarios without quota changes resulted in declines in UK output. But the biggest decline occurs with the unilateral free trade, or this no deal tariff schedule that we have. Those losses can be partly mitigated by signing free trade agreements with other countries, but only partly. So we see a 2.5% decline in output with no deal, and with the free trade agreements that is a bit less, that's a 1.8% decline in output. But the impacts are not evenly distributed across the industry, and they vary between different species. So there's the species that are not managed through quota suffer the negative impacts of an increase in tariff without the benefits of an increase in quota. But also those species that are more reliant on the EU market, such as cod, hake, herring and saithe, also suffer larger impacts as a result of tariffs. But if the UK takes an assertive approach towards quotas and renegotiating quota shares, then that can have a big impact on the results and on the UK sector, with output potentially increasing quite significantly. But those potential benefits for the UK obviously come at a cost to the EU, and they're unlikely to accept that without some form of retaliation or seeking compensation elsewhere. And we see that in their negotiating strategy and their desire to link access to waters and access to quota to other aspects of the Brexit negotiations around access to the EU market for other sectors. So that's something that needs to be watched out for really and borne in mind. Thank you. There's a couple of links there which give the links to the sort of the papers that underlie the presentation and the work that was done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. That was a great and interesting presentation. And the great thing about scenarios is that they alert us to things that we might not see. It's less about their predictive qualities and more about uncovering things that might have passed by our field of view. So it's interesting to see that range of scenarios presented. They'll hopefully give us food for thought. But of course, there's more potential scenarios that could play out. The overall 16 motions that were passed in Parliament yesterday gives an indication of that. So the whole wider trade conditions situation and the changing flux there is important to keep an eye on. And obviously government has to respond to the varied interests, including the relative size of different sectors and all manner of things. So I think it's appropriate then that following Susanna's presentation, we have Colin here today Colin Falconer here from DEFRA today. And Colin can tell us more about that policy perspective and also opportunities for industry input into that policy formulation. Colin.
Thank you, Angus. Real pleasure to be back in Aberdeen. This is my second tour of duty in fisheries. I have spent many a happy day in Aberdeen, Fraserburgh, Peterhead and various other places. So it's a real pleasure to be back and to see so many kind of friendly faces, all friendly, obviously, friendly faces from my last tour of duty in fisheries. So just to introduce myself, I look after a number of things within DEFRA. I look after external fisheries negotiations, so our negotiations with third countries like Norway, Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, China negotiations, and so on and so forth. Working very closely with Alan, as well as my colleagues in Belfast and Cardiff. Another part of my job, though, is looking after kind of trade policy for fisheries products. So it's that element of my work that I'll touch on now. Fortunately, I'm probably contractually obliged to mention Brexit at the start. I will mention this for a reason that I'll come on to in a second. Just to recap, obviously, depending on whether there's still a government for me to go back to this afternoon when I'm finished here, we are expecting either an extension of Article 50 to the 22nd of May, followed by a transition period till the end of 2020. If the withdrawal agreement is accepted, if the withdrawal agreement's not accepted, we'll have an extension till the 12th of April. And we know what's going on in Parliament today to help us work out what might come after the 12th of April. What I want to focus on today is, despite that backdrop, I want to focus on the kind of the longer term horizon for trade policy and for opportunities in the seafood sector. So I want to assume, and this, you will forgive me for making a heroic assumption, I want to make the assumption that the UK is operating on a long-term basis with an independent trade policy in the longer term. And what does that mean, therefore, for the seafood sector? So with that slightly heroic assumption in mind, where will the opportunities for the sector arise over the coming years, assuming we reach what I call a steady state in X days, years, months' time? Probably three components to that I want to just touch on today. Obviously, the key component to everything across any sector is having a stable and supportive macroeconomic environment in place, which the government's been working hard to do. Touch on that very briefly in a moment. Secondly, I want to touch on that framework, the international framework for international trade, which will be put into place, or is currently being put into place in part, which I'll come on to, but also the longer term free trade agreement architecture that will be put into place in the coming years. Really important to emphasize the point that seafood sectors will, perhaps a statement of the obvious, are taken into account and prioritized as part of that process. What's the proof point for that? The proof point for that to me is the contrast between the figure that I think Susanna used about 0.1% of UK GVA being devoted to fisheries and seafood. And if you compare that 0.1% figure, or if you said to anyone in Westminster that seafood and fisheries adopts or only takes up 0.1% of the political airtime, people would think you're mad. You know, seafood and fisheries punches way above its weight in political terms. We all know that. We all know the reasons why. So have no fear that seafood sector seafood sectors are taken into account in future negotiations on free trade and on international trade. Third key component is support from governments at all levels to help you do what your business does best and to help you take forward trading opportunities and increase market access. So I'll touch on those three things shortly. Firstly, just the macroeconomic framework. It's fundamental to everything we do in the economy, therefore worth rehearsing. Public finances continuing to improve in a broad sense from a pretty parlous situation not so long ago. But deficit reduction targets being met considerably earlier than expected, and perhaps even despite the despite what's going on politically and despite what you hear in the media, economic growth is holding up remarkably well. Growth forecasts continuing to hold up better than expected, and I think the key from perhaps one of the key proof points for the government in terms of putting the right macroeconomic framework and fiscal framework in place for businesses. Proof point around corporation tax being either the lowest in the G7 or the G8. I can never remember which one it is, but dropping from 19% this year to 18% next year. Obviously, other fiscal elements are put in place by the Scottish government. But from the UK perspective, we continue to put in place a fiscal environment which allows businesses to do what they need to do and what they do best. Moving on to the second element of what I was going to talk about was perhaps just rehearsing a little bit of the factual narrative around what has happened on free trade agreements so far and what will happen. So far, you'll have heard, or you'll have seen a number of reports in the media about free trade agreements signed with a variety of countries in the last few months. It's important to emphasize those are not the long-term FTAs that will be signed. Those are rolling over continuity arrangements. They're rollovers of the current arrangements that we have between the EU and third countries, rolling those over to make them UK third country agreements rather than the EU and a third country. So as a short term, as a kind of stopgap measure in the short term, government's putting in place FTAs on a continuity basis with a pretty wide variety of countries around the world. You'll have seen, I think it was last week, one put in place with Norway and Iceland, but a variety of those FTAs are currently under negotiation and will continue to be put in place in the coming months. I emphasize they are the short-term FTAs. to roll over current arrangements to provide businesses with continuity and to provide businesses with a minimum level of disruption to their trading arrangements. In the longer term, you'll be aware that one of the issues that the government's most interested in is putting together future free trade agreements with a whole variety of countries around the world. Worth just rehearsing a little bit the policy background to what those FTAs or the policy background to those FTAs and what they're likely to look like. This applies across all policy sectors, but will apply to seafood sectors and to fisheries as well. First point worth mentioning is that you can assume there will always be a bias towards free trade and towards a liberalization of trade policy across largely all policy areas in government. You should assume that that is the starting point, that the government will want to reduce barriers to trade, whether they're tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers, and that will be the starting point for all long-term FTAs. What else should FTAs do? They're also a means to an end. They're also a means to achieve a variety of other policy objectives. So you'll hear very often a lot of talk about how free trade agreements should be supporting labour protection, that should be supporting environmental protections and human rights, fighting corruption. Someone mentioned this morning about animal welfare issues will be a vast part of negotiations around free trade agreements. The classic example, which we're all probably slightly tired of hearing about, is the chlorinated chicken example, which will undoubtedly cause issues on the US FTA front. But nonetheless, animal welfare will be, for example, one of the many really key component parts of the kind of policy drivers behind FTAs. As ever, avoiding a race to the bottom to make sure that the highest possible standards are upheld and the highest quality produce is available to be exported. Clearly, as part of that, and as we've discussed, as many people have touched on today, Scottish seafood products are incredibly well placed to capitalise in that type of environment and with those types of policy drivers behind FTAs. Similarly, really placed to capitalise on that increased global demand for seafood. Mr. Ewing touched on this morning as well. One of the statistics that I'm always interested in drilling down into them a little bit further. In the early 60s, Europe and the USA accounted for nearly 50% of the world's total fish consumption. 2015, that was down to 20%. So long-term strategic changes where the Asian market is vastly more or becoming hugely more significant from the world fish consumption perspective. One other thing I just want to mention about free trade agreements, and it's worth touching on a little bit of process. I wouldn't be a civil servant if I didn't touch on process. On process, fair to say free trade agreements are relatively new to the UK government. They're not something we've had to negotiate in our own right for many, many years. That will be a new set of processes for us. We will need your input into that, into the process of negotiating free trade agreements, whether that's input from the processing sector, from the catching sector, from like Seafish, also crucially from Scottish government, and that all of those elements will be vital to make sure that we are able to negotiate free trade agreements that meet the needs of all parts of the UK. Clearly, Northern Ireland will be high up in my interests as well, obviously. So, what else is the UK government doing? First of all, working really closely with the Scottish government. absolutely vital that the collective forces of government are brought to bear on these issues. The UK government has a role. Obviously, the Scottish government has an equally and probably greater role from the perspective of promoting exports. But I think what I would just want to touch on is a few things here. There's a few different initiatives that are just worth rehearsing. And the reason why I mention them, simply that I would encourage you all to, and encourage you from your own business's perspective to get involved in the initiatives that the UK government is taking forward as much as possible. Whole variety of initiatives. Again, many taken forward in concert with our colleagues in the Scottish government and Seafood Scotland and elsewhere. First one I just touch on, let's not forget the GREAT campaign, which has been running for many years now. Internationally, very, very high recognition factor for the GREAT campaign. As you'll know, it's the GREAT campaign across all, effectively across all areas of government, across all exports. Seafood plays part of it. Personally, I'd like to make sure there's an even greater role for seafood in that campaign going forward. One example there from oysters. Another element that's often overlooked perhaps in the offer from all our governments. It's the UK offer around export finance. UK export finance has been around for a very, very long time, but perhaps doesn't always get the billing it deserves. What does it do? Helps businesses ensure that no viable UK export fails for lack of finance or insurance from the private sector. Helps UK exporters win contracts by providing attractive financing terms and making sure that UK exporters get paid by ensuring against buyer default. So it's an initiative that, as I say, has been around for a long time, but I think it's really important just to remind people of its availability and that it is still there. And it's not only still there, it's you'll have seen in the last few years, the Chancellor's increased the headroom available to UK export finance to support exports for UK businesses. Not all of that headroom is actually being used. So there's still a great deal of headroom for businesses to use on from export finance. One other initiative that I just want to flag up, EMFF, obviously a very, the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, really important devolved aspect to the EMFF, obviously. The one that I just want to draw attention to is you may have seen the announcement from Secretary of State at DEFRA just before Christmas for additional funding to help businesses through the period of the implementation period, through the transition period, on the assumption that the withdrawal agreement goes through. That's 37 million across the UK, pretty significant chunky figure for to aid businesses, as I say, 2019 and 2020. Then thereafter, we expect a further replacement to the EMFF in the assumption that we're acting as an independent coastal state. And you should expect to see more details of that in the spending review, which will take place over the summer and which should be announced probably later in the summer as well. A few other initiatives. I very deliberately flag up something that I don't think really gets enough attention. It's the FCO, the Foreign Office, and the Department of International Trade's diplomatic missions around the world. So with the exception of a bit of a gap in the Sahel and Africa, no matter where you're exporting to, you can assume that there will be a UK embassy, Foreign Office and Department of International Trade team. You will assume that there will be a team there who already have a really significant amount of market knowledge, who have a little black book of contacts that will be incredibly helpful to you if you are exporting there. Just to give you one example, just thinking of the Chinese market, my DIT colleague at lunchtime was helpful enough to remind me that on food and drink alone, in what I call post in the embassy in Beijing and also in Shanghai. We've got 8 people working on food and drink alone in the embassy in Shanghai. Obviously, that's complemented by really helpful and additional resource from the Scottish government and from other agencies across the UK. But please do make use of embassies around the world. If you need help accessing them, come to me. I can put you in touch with them. Come and talk to my DIT colleague, who I'll point out at the end, to get contact details for who you need to be speaking to. Similarly, one thing I just want to flag up: recent appointment of 9 trade commissioners around the world. These are kind of trade commissioners are kind of super ambassadors. So, for example, Trade Commissioner for Asia, Natalie Black, based in Singapore, but covering kind of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia, New Zealand. Roving ambassadors, effectively promoting any UK trade that is going on in that area. They are extremely keen to work with any of you as businesses, similarly with Seafish and with others. I strongly recommend that you use their resources and exploit them ruthlessly as much as you wish. Finally, next steps. As I say, just to summarize, I think the seafood sector in Scotland is incredibly well placed to capitalize on global markets and on their expansion. We've got free trade agreements coming up. Please feel free to be pestering the likes of me as much as you like about what you want to see in those free trade agreements. Feel free, obviously, as well to discuss your requirements and your desires with Scottish Government colleagues, but also feel free to come to us in DEFRA to help us be sure that we are negotiating free trade agreements and other negotiations on your behalf effectively. We need your input. We need your market insight. And ultimately, the whole purpose of it is we want to help you export more. We want you to export even more of your great products. And please do use all the resources of governments across the UK that are available to you. On that, thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. That was welcome clarity around the trade agreement landscape. Particularly, I think, just making clear the from the noise that we hear on a day-to-day basis about trade agreements, what's been signed, what's not been signed, what's still waiting to be signed, etc., what's happening in the short term versus what's happening in the long term, and the opportunity for industry stakeholders to step into that space and contribute thoughts and ideas and requirements into government. Turning now, in terms of the schedule of this particular panel, down and continuing that thread to perhaps where there are opportunities and data that might help you engage with industry. We've got Graham Young from Scotland Food and Drink up to talk next about market opportunities. Graham, on you go.
Okay, thanks, Angus. Just want to talk to you a little bit about the work that's happening within the Scotland Food and Drink Partnership. And well, Colin started talking about sort of trade and policy, bringing that further back home, back into Scotland, and looking at an economic development perspective of what's happening within the Scottish Partnership. Scotland Food and Drink are a membership organisation. We have over 350 processing members. Many of you in the room are members of our organisation. We have also 100 support and supply companies as well. We have all the major, or will by the end of this month, hopefully have all the major retailers and all the major food service companies within the UK as our members. We bring together the butchers, the bakers, the seafood companies, the salmon company, the drinks companies, and align beside that the Scottish Government and its economic development agencies through Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland, Zero Waste Scotland are there as well. So over the last 2 years ago, that group, through our facilitation leadership, came together to create Ambition 2030, an ambitious roadmap for the food and drink industry in Scotland. Our ambition, and we believe if everything works and pulls together in a fair tailwind, we have the potential to double the value of, not necessarily the size, but the value, the turnover of the food and drink industry in Scotland. Since then, I've been working closely and supporting each of the individual trade organisations to look at their own sector strategies. So we have one for venison, we've got fruit and vegetables in there, we've got a dairy sector strategy, aquaculture, and Patrick, who I think maybe has just left the room very shortly, will hopefully fill the last piece of the jigsaw in with a sector strategy for the wild-caught seafood sector. Putting all that work into a single slide, really encapsulating our focus. We were doing this around about the time that the prospect of a referendum was coming up and Brexit potentially. A few people said we were mad to think about it. It feels a wee bit maybe mad today to be standing here thinking what are our opportunities, but I think that stood us in good stead. And it was Philip Hammond at the time had said, the country needs to get Brexit ready, the company needs to get Brexit fit. And I think irrespective of what happens through the rest of this afternoon, tonight and over the next few weeks, I think the markets that we play in will change and evolve. But we took some quite strong messages back from the consultation when we're developing this, that it's not all about exports. There's a lot more work to be done at home, and you'll hopefully see through the next few slides that we're focusing a lot more on what can be done within the UK market and what also can be done within the home market in Scotland. And again, irrespective of where we trade, we need to build our reputation as the land of food and drink. We've talked about investment within the industry quite a lot over the last 2 days, and building that reputation and investor confidence is really important, and also in terms of attracting new customers and buyers at home and also abroad. The key pillars of looking at supply chain, if we're going to be a lot more responsible and streamlined in what we do and more resource efficient, that work has to come with whole supply chain approaches. We need to be a more innovative industry. So driving innovation, and Rachel from the Make Innovation Happen initiative, our posters here. So if you're interested in a single stop shop of how to support a company to be more innovative in Scotland, that's a really good example of what's happening. And we've had lots of conversations already about peoples and skills and the need for new people within the industry. The export work, it's been talked about quite a lot yesterday and today. So, and given we're coming towards the end of the day, I will skip through pretty quickly. But why is it of interest? If you look at the map of where we are with food exports around the world, we are very European centric. Flick forward to see what whiskey are doing. They have a much greater diversified position around the world. So there are opportunities and doors that these people can open for us, and we've signed a collaboration with the Scotch Whisky Association to help to support other sectors within the wider food and drink family to increase their exports. And that was one of the main reasons in this creation of the family of in-market experts that both Patrick talked about yesterday and Mr. Ewing referred to this morning. So people who are at your beck and call around the world to help you. It's not just helping the individual trade organisations, but they also do one-to-one company work as well. They're all going to be back, a couple of plugs, they'll all be back in June, and I think it will be back in Shire Grange, so there'll be one-to-one surgeries for individual companies, or there'll be a trade organisation stay as well, so people will get a chance to come in and interact with them and get greater insight into the markets. But it's not just about that. I don't really maybe expect you to be able to read that from this distance, but if you take the top of this slide, that's just the in-market specialist projects and the key markets that we've identified, but significant other activities that we do and need to do to develop our exports. We have a joint market program looking at how we match up beef and seafood and our craft beer and our craft gin, etc., and trying to maximise the cooperation between those different segments. And Patrick mentioned surf and turf yesterday. I don't think that would have happened with Quality Meat Scotland 2 or 3 years ago, but facilitation, getting these people around the table and talking together has strengthened that Team Scotland approach. Emerging exporters, existing exporters and mature exporters, they all need slightly different levels of support. So as we develop this programme, or the second phase of this work, we need to think about how we look after individual needs. Inward missions as well can be controversial if there's already mature relationships with buyers in existing markets. But where they have worked well is where the type of work that Patrick referred to in terms of bringing journalists in. And we had the Federation of Scottish Chefs over a couple of years ago, letting them see the full extent and breadth of the Scottish seafood offering that we have around the world. Work was starting to happen already on certification and logistics and getting product to market. I think the Brexit problems have accelerated that, but there's still more to do. And many of you in the room will be only too aware of the differentiation in terms of pricing through export certification of local authorities, etc. So how do we try and standardize that? And another piece of that jigsaw that Colin mentioned is export finance. It came to the fore a bit when Russia closed their borders to particularly the pelagic sector, and it got a bit more recognition in Scotland, but there's certainly a lot more to do to tap into that area. And the other big plug, showcasing Scotland in Gleneagles, bringing 125 buyers, sort of roughly half and half from around the world, other half from the UK, and about 125 companies. We did it 2 years ago. It generated about £60 million of additional sales. It's just one very massive speed dating session. But as I say, it's not all about exports, so we're very conscious of that. And just last autumn, we started to build up our activity and looking at the home market as well. It's very important, both looking after the customers that we already have, but trying to explore and find new customers at home. So 3 sort of very top level elements in that strategy that all sort of link together. But this work, which I say is just getting going, we're looking at sort of insights. So who are our customers? Where do they exist? Where are the market opportunities? We've got very strong insight and support within Seafish, some sit within Seafood Scotland. And again, we've got that within Scotland Food and Drink. Strategic relationships, who are the key customers? And let's build some strategic and long-term relationships with them. Our chairman, Dennis Overton, will say that he wants Scotland to be the best place to have a food and drink business or to do food and drink business with. And we would see that strategic relationship as part of the latter of that. And it's mapping ambition. And some companies will just want to trade locally, trade across the whole of Scotland, trade across the whole of the UK. So what do they want to do and how can we match them the best support and services? And then looking at capabilities. So I'll come back onto that in terms of companies with innovation and getting to compete more effectively, and then a number of different sales development mechanisms that I'll come on to. So in terms of some of the capacity building work, mentioned market insights already, we believe that the whole area of health and wellness and well-being is a really important market for the Scottish industry. We've commissioned some research along with Scottish Enterprise in this area. Claire had mentioned earlier, a big thing in North America about high protein foods. So seafood fits really well with that. So that high protein, low carb, the fuller, longer whole area. The veganism and flexitarianism, pescatarianism, the move away from red meat creates opportunities for everybody in the room. And likewise, even with some of these plant-based diets, bringing some of those key sort of things, quinoa, beetroot, etc., the kale, that's getting interest in this segment. You're thinking those who are making ready meals and things like that, preparing things for the food service sector, how do you pull some of that stuff in? Food to go and snacks and healthy versions of that, really, really keen. So again, we'll be looking at how we develop support to industry and companies in the coming months and years in that area. And then BRC and Salsa, we talked about our reputation and our brand. It's hard to build it up before it's easy to strip it back down. So what are the technical competencies that companies need either to protect their brand or also to compete more effectively in a home and an international market? And just before Christmas, we launched a BRC and a Salsa support scheme to help companies to get accreditation in both those areas. We've talked about people in the industry a lot, and it's the number one thing that we're getting fed back from our members is the whole challenges with recruitment, but we're starting to look at it slightly differently. Once we pay all that money and efforts to get them into the business, can we do things more effectively to retain them within our business? So we're working with Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands to look at a recruitment and retention toolkit and some tips and good guides for companies to play in that area. And then refreshing to see from Mike and Jonas, a lot of coverage already today about the whole Industry 4.0, robotics, the Internet of Things, big data, etc. So again, an area that we're keen to see greater and further uptake within the industry in that area. So what are some of the activation things that we're doing? A couple of examples recently launched by Mr. Ewing at the Scottish Parliament, and ASDA Supplier Development Academy. So ticking a number of the boxes, strengthening our strategic relationship with ASDA to work with a group of companies. We'll start with maybe about 40 existing ASDA suppliers from Scotland. We'll flag those up to them, they already know them, and they'll narrow that down, but we'll provide support and funding to allow ASDA and a number of other agencies to come in and help to build the company capability. And that has very much got a very direct pull through within sales. Colleagues have worked recently with Waitrose, so if you go into Waitrose, if you're lucky enough to have one near you and look at their craft beer offering, significantly better than it was a couple of years ago. And that was about just introducing to Waitrose the range and depth of craft beer companies that have in Scotland and leaving them to do the business once we made the introductions. The home market as well, a piece of research here, looking at menu descriptors in London and how a menu was described, and then what the price of that main plate was. And you'll see fourth from the end is the word Scottish. So a significant recognition of the Scottish proposition within the London market, and that's an area that we want to try and build on further as well. And we've had some colleagues facilitating a trade mission down to casual dining in Excel. It was quite drink heavy in terms of representation. So if there are any seafood companies or you know of any that would be interested in this market, please get them along and get them involved. Another colleague just back from the Northern Restaurant and Bar show, just having a walk around and look around, and similar feel. It does seem to be sort of quite drink centric, but we're continually looking and scouting at opportunities where we can represent Scotland, Team Scotland, at these various events to target the home market. And bring it a little bit closer to home again, local sourcing. So we carried out a survey where we looked at 1,000 Scottish and 1,000 UK consumers and asked them a lot of questions, and this one relevant to the importance of local sourcing. The rest of the UK is in blue bars, and the Scottish consumers, their responses in orange. And we can see, surprise, surprise, Scottish people like to see Scottish produce in their restaurants, hotels, and in their shops. And dairy, red meat, poultry, fish and shellfish, fruit and veg, bakery goods, and maybe a bit of a tail off seems to be less important within the sort of original sourcing of beer, etc., and soft drinks. So again, gives us confidence to think about doing more. That showcase that we talked about at Gleneagles, lots of feedback saying it's very, very good, but why is it all to do with international or UK buyers? Let's do some closer to home. So we took that model out on the road, and we did the first regional showcasing in Glasgow about 18 months ago. On average, we've done further ones in Tayside, Inverness, just completed one in Murrayfield, and we're looking to do one in the northeast very, very shortly, and then there'll be a further one sort of around Stirling or central area. About 70 buyers and 70 suppliers in a day. Again, that speed dating concept, quite a good representation from both retail, specialty retail, and food service in terms of buying coming along to these events. And then Scott Hots, we've been in and out of Scott Hot as Team Scotland over the years, but again, this renewed focus in the home market, there's representation there, maybe more sort of hospitality and chefs focus, as many of you will know within that segment. And then opportunities with the tourist industry as well. What's the win-win there? So a piece of work from Visit Scotland. What do visitors do? Well, we know they sleep and stay somewhere, and we know that they eat and drink when they're in Scotland. So and 90% on average of people who come to Scotland want to dine out. But more importantly, I think, is that the European visitors and visitors from the rest of the world are specifically interested and wanting to try local food when they come here. So what do they think of our food? So again, the same segments. There's two bars. The blue bars at the bottom indicate their expectations of Scottish food and drink before they arrived. The beige coloured brown bars are the realisation of what it was after they left. So the good news is that we're doing a good job in exceeding their expectation. The rather worrying thing is, particularly with the Europeans, is what's their expectations before they come, and actually will they come if they think that our food and drink offering in this country is just quite so lousy. So what do we do about it? So we've been working over the last year with the Scottish Tourism Alliance, looking at a food tourism strategy for Scotland. And again, with the launch of Ambition 2030, a lot of these things still in very early days, but we're getting going. Those tourists will spend 20 pence in the pound in food and drink when they come. How do we make that 25 or 30? And how do we get a lot more tourists coming to the country? And the reverse and joined up piece of this is if we get more tourism coming in, we get more flights, which then helps to ease some of the solutions that we're trying to find on our export work in terms of extra plane capacity coming into the country. So there's a definite win-win and within all this work. The whisky trade do it so well. So what can we learn from them? What can we leverage in terms of what they do? It's about having the right venues, the right destinations. There's a big piece in terms of skills within the area as well. So part of the reason why we're not getting enough local food sold and imported food sold in its place is the inability of front of house staff to be able to uptrade and tell the story. So a significant investment will happen in getting that right. Hazel's given me a 2-minute warning. I've got a video that I want to show you, but in terms of national branding, Scottish labelling is very important, as again, no surprise, very important to the home market. Maybe less so when we look at how it's compared with other. We ask people what they thought of the Scottish proposition. So that leads us to think about what we've done. So, but 5-6 years ago, every food and drink sector in Scotland were marketing themselves completely differently. We co-developed this branding, and you see maybe that's what it looks like, be it fruit and veg, be it bakery, be it dairy. So we're beginning to sort of market ourselves a bit more effectively together, but it's still a competitive area. And we think of what Ireland have done in terms of their origin green, and New Zealand just do this thing so well. I think we need to think about what's happening again on our national branding. So there's a significant development happening in Scotland with Visit Scotland, Scottish Government, Scottish Development International, a program called an initiative called Scotland Is Now. I'm just going to show you a 1-minute video that they have produced, and then maybe just leave you a couple of questions and thoughts on it.
Now is a place where hope calls home. Now is compassion and freedom to roam. Now builds bridges, now breaks down walls. Now is new thinking, now gives its all. Now is the heart, the soul and the head. Now is the town you'll want to paint red. Now makes the future, now bangs the drum. Now is the welcome for all those who come. Now is silence and breathtaking sights. Now bucks the trend. Now fights for rights. Now is new jobs. Now inspires youth. Now faces up to an inconvenient truth. Now more than ever is what the world needs. Now is the hope that our country feeds. There is no waiting. Scotland is now.
So impressive video, professionally produced, significant amounts of money going behind that. It's fantastic if you want to invest in Scotland, if you want to visit Scotland, live in Scotland, or come and be educated in Scotland. But what would an outward projection of that campaign look like? And is our current country branding, the Land of Food and Drink branding, ready for a quick review? So that's something which, again, we want to try and spend some time over the rest of this year having a dialogue. Colin has mentioned the great brand as well. So how do we get those two things working together for the greater benefit of the industry within Scotland? So like all the other speakers, please, I'm around for the rest of the afternoon, albeit that's getting shorter. But please come up and have a chat, or any questions, just come see me afterwards.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Graham. A lot of analysis going on in there. There's a lot of initiatives, a lot of connecting dots across sectors to tease out those opportunities, to realize them, to push them on. And I'm sure that will be a great benefit to the industry, but it'll also be a great benefit to UK government to draw on that capability and those assets as well. We're a bit short of time because of the late start, but I'd like to invite my colleague Irina up to give the last presentation, which is going to focus on the trade data and our trade flows in relation to seafood, technology notwithstanding. Thanks, Irina.
All right. Thank you, Angus. Hi, everyone. It's a bit of pressure to do the last talk, and then I have to use my own computer just to be able to screen everything from the internet so you can get an idea what I've been working on last year. So I'm going to talk about trade and tariff tool, which been developed last year by myself in collaboration with the rest of the colleagues in Seafish, and also with some people who helped us to try the beta version, and also our consultants who helped us to develop the tool itself. So the outline of my presentation, I'm going to talk about why we decided to develop this tool, how we decided to approach this project, and what. And basically most of the time I will spend showing you the tool itself. So why? I'm not going to tell you why, because a lot of people already told you where we are, the current state, but obviously the situation now increased the interest in trade data and what is going on in international trade relationship. And we decided in Seafish that we would like to support decision of individual firms and businesses to succeed in their international seafood trade. So how the main objective of our project was to develop self-service tool which will include UK trade and tariff data and will allow end user to analyze the data flow and trade flow at product and country level, species as well. So the tool is supposed to be interactive, informative, user-friendly, and obviously updatable, so I don't need to spend a lot of time to add the new data sets when they are coming in. So what, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce the new trade and tariff tool developed by Seafish and freshly designed and available online now. So this is the first view, and I'm now going to the tool itself and Tableau web page where it's based now. So this is the first overview page of the tool. We have a possibilities here to analyze UK seafood trade, import, as well as, internet connection, as well as export. Yes. So once again, full screen. So export, voila. A few seconds to wait till the data is processed. So basically the main idea is that you can switch between import and export. You could analyze specific years you are interested in. Currently, the tool includes 2018 data, which is provisional as it was as in March 2000 this year, and is provided to us by our consultancy firm, but it's obviously coming from HMRC. The tool is developed using EU MOFA methodology, which means we can allocate each product code in combined nomenclature to specific species, and that allows us to filter for a specific species. So if you are interested in, for example, code trade flows, you could just select the code and see what are their destination of the export of the code, or as well you can change between export and import. Let's see again. Probably my computer is a little bit excited, and and obviously I'm using the Wi-Fi internet, so it needs a little bit of time to process the inquiries. So now I'm in the code. So you can see the main countries where the code being exported, or where the code is coming from. And on the top, you can see also the value and weight of the product you just selected. You can also see the main countries where the product is going to. And if you want to see all of them, you just can go there and see all the zeros. The countries are also grouped to non-EU and EU and EA non-EU countries, so you can also have an idea in which countries groups the product is exported. Again, it's very easy to remove the filter. You just press clear filters, or you can just press another the small filter sign and next to the species. There are some active filters allowing you to filter the data when you look at it. You can also change here between weight and value and look at the main species in terms of weight, for example. And then if you are interested in trend analysis and specific species analysis, you could go into more detail into the other tabs. So for example, if I'm now moving from the overview going to the species traded, you can see the trade flows by species, for example, cod, salmon, and where the destination or the origin country. So in this case, we are import, so it's origin where the species are coming from. And then you could, so the cod is the main species and Alaskan falling, and they are coming from China. And you can see, we can also check what is coming from Iceland. And again, cod, haddock, and shrimps. Then moving on, if I remove the filter and go to origins and destinations, again, there is a possibility to look at some specific trade flows. I will just remove 2018. There are a bit of extreme values in 2018 because of the data is preliminary, so you need to be cautious using it. But then again, these are the destination countries, origin countries where the fish is coming from. And you can again select specific species from the right on the right hand side where there are active filters, or you can again select the specific species from the filters. And if I go again, where we are, let's do code again. So got the filters which you select on the right hand side. These filters apply to all tabs, so you can also go afterwards into the preservation and presentation tab and see what type of cod products are imported or exported. So in this case, we could see that most of the cod is coming as fillets, and if we check what is the preservation, would be frozen fillets and fresh fillets as well. So then there is the last few tabs allows you to get into the information on tariffs. So in this case, we are filtering the data set into specific CN combined nomenclature code, which allows afterwards to get into the UK trade government HMRC website. For example, again, code, if I select frozen fillets, I will filter the table with codes, and which gives me an MFN tariff 2017 that is indicative. We didn't check all the tariffs. We just put some information which was available in the shape which was which could be used in this tool. So, and if you want to get more information, more precise information, you are redirected into the government webpage where all the information is available and most up-to-date information is available. So if you want to explore import condition, you just choose the import condition for that product. You just select it in the tool, and then you can analyze all different tariffs and conditions that you need to meet to import from different countries. So when I'm going back to the tool again, so this is the tariff, and in the end, you are also, you are able to export the data set. If you are, for example, interested in some specific analysis, looking for specific data, you can again select the specific products, select the species. Also, you could select specific product, which is at CN8 product level, like frozen fillets. And then again, if you press just on the table and make a download cross tab to Excel, you will generate the Excel file, which you will be able to analyze and create your own visuals. So the tool is now based in Tableau public web page, but we also have the link on our website, on Seafish website to the tool. It's Insights and Research. Just a sec. Let's see, and then market and trade, and there is a trade and tariff tool in Tableau, and the direct link is available in here. So that's it. And if you have any questions, or I'm here for a few more minutes.
We'll take it there anyway. Thank you very much, Irina. And I don't think anyone should underestimate how much effort's required to put that tool together, because what it requires is data sources from different organizations, as well as different teams within Seafish. But it's fantastically flexible, as Irina's just demonstrated. And 2 years ago, it's come back to a point that I think Colin made earlier, that we are having to develop capabilities because of this new this new situation we're in. We're having to understand the trading landscape. We have to have new tools and new initiatives, and that's an example of how we've taken a step in that direction. And some of the other speakers this afternoon in this particular session have demonstrated that there are other support mechanisms there as well. As I said at the beginning of this session, this is about understanding the trading landscape. And yes, Brexit is there in the center, but the trading landscape is changing as we speak all over the world, and changes we don't have control over. So we do have to understand that as best we can. We need the tools to help us, and we need to be able to input into government. I'd said at the beginning as well to have a think as you were listening to the speakers of any questions that you might have. We've got a short session because we're running slightly behind in terms of schedule. But if anybody has a question, please raise your hand. And as earlier, please say who you are, your organization, and also perhaps who the question should be directed to from our panel this afternoon. Floor's open. Over to you. Okay, Hazel, go.
Thanks. So Hazel Curtis from Seafish. I have got a new remit related to international trade along with my colleague Lynn. So I was very interested to hear Colin's offers for help, Graham's offers for help, and we're thinking about how we can help. And I'm keen that we're not all running around in different directions. would everybody be interested in seeing how we can put together a seafood specific offering for those interested in exporting? Maybe I can pass the microphone to Graham.
Yep. Go, Graham.
Yeah, Hazel, absolutely. There was a line, 2 years worth of strategy development in 20 minutes and a few other things as well. It's really hard to condense down to one page, but streamlined and collaborative was one of those bars on that rocket diagram that I showed early on. So bringing all the different support agencies together, trying to make life a lot simpler for the businesses. Absolutely. I'm very happy to host, happy to facilitate and put that together. Yeah, because I think one thing we do know is that business is getting harder than ever, and public funds available to support business, although we're working hard to try and encourage there to be more, is getting ever tighter when you think of health, education, all the stuff that goes on there as well within the demands on government's resources. Industry doing more themselves and doing more collectively. So how do we get as efficient as possible and make every pound note go as far as possible? Very, very keen to help to put that together.
Yes is the answer.
Great. Eva.
Thanks, Angus. Question for Arena about the new tool. So how do you see businesses using this tool? So what's the advantage to business now that we've got this ready for them to use?
I think that if you are importer, for example, it will be easy for you to also see where the other competitors probably are sourcing the same fish species, for example. So you could explore other opportunities, other markets where you could source your fish, or vice versa. If you are exporter, you could see where other where other people are trading, where other people are selling their fish, and also find a new markets for yourself, and also check where are the new occurring markets probably also starting to occur on the maps and as main countries of export or import again.
I mean, that is an interesting, I mean, the development of this tool is an interesting step in itself. Because I think about 2 years ago, if we were to ask the question, as we often did at the Whitefish Forum, Davy, what for domestic producers of whitefish, what's happening with whitefish imports? Where are they coming from, and what values and what volumes and so on? And understanding that landscape would take some time to generate. But with a tool like this, again, it goes back to that labor automation question about using tools and software that's there to help us with what we need. Any other questions? Yes.
Not so much a question, but just to pick up on Hazel's point. My name's Tony Lamb. I'm the chap from the Department for International Trade that Colin referred to earlier. Just like to thank Seafish for organising this event. One of the areas that we're very keen to develop within the Department for International Trade on the trade promotion side is an offer, a UK-wide offer around seafish exports. So we've been really interested, my colleague Menna and I have been really interested to speak to colleagues over the past day or so, and also to hear from Seafood Scotland, Scotland Food and Drink, and others about how we can develop that offer for a UK-wide support for fish exports. We work very closely with colleagues in SDI. They're our link into the Scottish business community. But I suppose my answer to Hazel's question is yes, very much so. And we want to do that on a UK-wide offer, but really interested to hear what's going on in Scotland and how we can work collaboratively.
Yeah, indeed. Bringing those capabilities together. Any burning questions as we start closing the session? No? Okay. Well, can I invite, before I do invite Jimmy Bucking up to close the session, I should just say that we will be wanting your feedback on this conference, and that all delegates will be pestered to complete a survey so that we do get your feeling of how well it's gone. Areas that's worked and also areas that haven't worked, so that when we have subsequent sessions, we can tailor them accordingly. just to wrap up then, thanks very much to all of the panel speakers and also to those asking questions. Jimmy, if you'd like to come up and close the show, that would be great.
Well, you're all wide awake, eh? Anyway, standing before you today, I feel I've got the seafood sector well covered, because I think about the things I've done in over my career, and I wear many hats now. Vessel owner, I'm managing a seafood supply company, executive officer of the Scottish Seafood Association. I'm a member of the Scottish Advisory Committee and proudly been elected or appointed as a Seafish board member, and I think that's a huge privilege to get that opportunity to serve. So I think that kind of gives me a good base to just wind the summit up. I hope you've kind of all enjoyed it. I have. It's an opportunity to network, but it's also an opportunity to come here and learn a wee bit about our own industry. I've been in this for 40 years, and it's amazing. You sit and listen to all the different sectors, and you're still learning, and we'll continue to learn. So, but we are living in unprecedented times and uncertainty, that's for sure. And the one thing I'm sure about is we really can't be sure. And it is such a fluid situation. So it is, I suppose, for a political geek, it is interesting, but it's also very challenging and very concerning for business. So we kind of wish we could get some sort of conclusion. So from my perspective, the summit has delivered maybe a couple of key benefits, which is we have heard from an excellent panel of speakers, and thanks to the team for putting all that together, because it has been very wide and varied over the 2 days, and I'm sure we'll learn from this summit, and I'm hopeful there will be other ones. I'm looking at the team there, and we'll do it bigger and better, and we'll just get even better at it. So, but it has also provided a wonderful opportunity to do some just to relax a wee bit, do some networking, and just kind of generally chat and exchange views, and use the opportunity to nourish our networking opportunities and such like. Going on to the Fergus Ewing MSP, I thought he was very good today. I feel he is a minister that has the best interests of the sector at heart. He understands the sector, and I think he's very committed to it. And I have found, starting to work with him and his team below him, that they do want to do well for the seafood sector. And I think, Ken, to be honest, in this turbulent times, I think we are lucky to have a minister like that who's doing his best in the political arena for the industry. He did. I challenged him a wee bit on markets, and he explained, Ken, that new markets are important to us, but we must never forget our existing markets are the markets that we've built our businesses on, and they should be really well looked after and nurtured. New markets are great, and it's great opportunities, but look after the customers you've got, because they're the people that made the businesses we've got. So it's maybe right that we should just remember that as well. Where a successful and thriving seafood industry starts with good governance and good management. And it's hugely, we are positive about our industry. I know we've got a lot of fears, but I look at people in this room, and generally we are positive about the future, and let's hope that it all works out for the best. So the session one, changing resources in the landscape, I just learned what that is. You can't use the word Brexit, but it is about Brexit. And we know that Brexit will deliver greater control over our marine resources, and therefore the potential for more fish to be landed into Scotland could create huge opportunities. However, that is the easy bit, and our challenge is to make sure that as an industry, we have the infrastructure and the capacity in place so that we can maximise the benefit to Scotland from any additional resource we get. And I'm certain this can only happen if the industry and government work in partnership. and we are working through the challenges and with the government to deliver that. So it is difficult, but as I say, working together is the way to do it. Build bridges, again, putting walls up is near the way forward. So session 2, labour constraints. Well, we all know that the problems that comes with that. We've seen the figures, and even the P&J this week has reported that how severe it is for especially the northeast. And it's something, again, we've got to keep pushing the government on. I do think they didn't realise that how severe it is up here in northeast Scotland. And although we're very fixated on the future and innovation, that doesn't solve tomorrow's problem. That is futuristic, but we've got to make sure that business can continue to operate, and we've got the manpower to get the throughput, or else the economic benefit will just be lost. Going on to session 3, the changing trade landscapes. It was clear from yesterday's international trade seminar and today's summit that the business needs to be prepared and ready to adapt to the new trading landscape. And I think we are very all aware of that. Fortunately, there are a wealth of resources available providing that information and guidance and support. And we'll need to ensure that we're equipped to overcome the challenges in the short term and make the most of the opportunities that will emerge. There are some personal thank yous I would like to do on behalf of the Seafish board. I would like to thank all the speakers who've contributed here today. You've come here, some of you had to do presentations and didn't even know what you're going to present on. So I think it's been challenging for you guys. But from me and on behalf of you guys, I would like to put a special thanks to Marcus, to Aoife, Hazel, Angus, Lynn, Ian, Jess, and the many other Seafish people here that have made this happen today. Could we just give them a round of applause, folks? So there is quite a lot going on, but again, it was good to hear just before lunch from John Hester about investing in young people, because that really is for future. They are tomorrow's people. Although we're privileged to be in the industry right now, we've got to invest in them, innovate them, mentor them, and just make them the ambassadors of the future. And I think it's a great program of our own, and I hope that other companies and people share the vision and get on board, because young people are the future. I think it was a Prime Minister said that. Anyway, I would just like to kind of wind up a wee bit. Say it has been a privilege to be part of this. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and may I just say safe home, folks. Thank you.